So Robert decided, right, we'll go and buy a vacuum chamber and test this idea, see if it has validity. So he bought a vacuum chamber, not a very big one, because commercial vacuum chambers can be quite expensive.
Mm-hmm.
And he tested it and found that by drawing a vacuum in the chamber, you can test the vacuum is there by putting a bowl of water inside the chamber, increase the vacuum, and eventually the water will start to boil. That's called outgassing. It's one of the effects of a vacuum, outgassing. It wasn't producing a very high vacuum, so they bought another motor to attach to the vacuum chamber, which produced a slightly higher vacuum, not much higher, because it's very difficult to produce it. It takes several hours to evacuate the air. There's quite a lot of air at sea level. So you've got to pump all this out. All these molecules have got to be coming out. And sure enough, they put a film into it, into the vacuum chamber, pumped the air out, about 8 hours, because that is the length of time that Apollo 17 were conducting their EVAs, 8 hours on the lunar surface. Could a film survive an 8-hour vacuum test? So they did the 8 hours, released the vacuum, took the film out of the vacuum chamber, put it into a camera, used it to take photographs, and sure enough, even at a relatively low level of vacuum, the color balance of the film was completely shot. Blues weren't blue, reds weren't red, greens weren't green. Even the black and white film was starting to show misty, because that's the effect you get, where you get the film starts to reduce the contrast. That's what fogging is. So they demonstrated it and published their result. We published the result on Aulis website, aulis.com. But also Robert has done several films of the work he did and how he did it and what he did and the care he took over ensuring that everything was done by the book in terms of developing the film. He even went out and bought the S-star-based film. S-star means polyester-based film. That's the plastic backing onto which the emulsion, the light-sensitive emulsion, is coated. And it's the light-sensitive emulsion which outgasses, because it started life as a liquid. It's dried when it's on the film, or your camera will get a bit mucky. If the emulsion outgasses, that means that the lighter elements contained in hydrogen, helium, the lighter elements outgas, i.e. are ripped out by the vacuum, or rather they can't stay in because there's nothing to hold them in, so they drift out. The film is shot. We've demonstrated this.
You mentioned that with the vacuum you're only able to simulate to a certain altitude above Earth. So first of all, it's a two-part question. What was the altitude, approximate altitude that is, that you, Robert, and Scott were able to simulate? And then talk about that altitude versus what the actual conditions on the lunar surface would be like, because if you're only able to test, let's say, up to 100 kilometers or 150 miles altitude, and you still got some images, but very distorted images, what would that be like with the vacuum on the lunar surface? So I guess the second question would be, what is the difference between the vacuum at that altitude versus the vacuum on the lunar surface?
Good question. Interesting point. Let's just explain how vacuum is measured. It's measured in a unit called Torr, T-O-R-R, named after an Italian scientist, Evangelista Torricelli, who developed the first workable barometer in the 17th century. So he was familiar with pressure, because that's what barometers measure, difference in pressure.
Yeah.
At sea level, here on Earth, the Torr level is 760. Now that is, anybody who's familiar with barometers and vacuum will know that that is the equivalent of millimeters of mercury in a barometer. So 760 Torr is what happens at sea level. You get to the top of Mount Everest, which is 30,000 feet, 6 miles up, where jumbo jets fly if they're cruising between continents. Pressure there is 150 Torr, so it's considerably less. You go up another 50 miles to the edge of space, you're looking at Torr 10 to the minus 3.
So what altitude, Marcus, would 10 to the minus 3 be roughly?
About 100 kilometers, 60 miles.
Okay.
International Space Station, say orbiting at 200 miles above the Earth's surface, pressure there would be about 10 to the minus 6, torr 10 to the minus 6. Because the further away from Earth you get, the less there is to press down. There are still particles of atmosphere which have drifted off, but it's the gravity of Earth which is holding most of it down. Yes, it can drift off. When you get to the Moon, it's torr 10 to the minus 12, several degrees higher than any pressure, certainly on Earth, but at the Kármán line, the International Space Station. So the further away from Earth you go, the harder the level of vacuum. And that is the key point. We all think of space as being basically the same, whether it's just above Earth or near the Moon or near the Sun or near Jupiter. No, it does vary because there are particles of atmosphere, i.e. matter, drifting off the Earth, which still affect any object there, but not by very much. I say torr 10 to the minus 12, that's 0.0 with 12 noughts after it, a very, very small fraction of what occurs even at the top of Mount Everest.
Your experiment was equivalent to altitude you said was a Kármán line, about 62 miles?
Yeah.
And that was 10 to the minus 6?
No, 10 to the minus 6 would be at the space station.
Okay.
10 to the minus 3 would be at the Kármán line. So obviously the further away you get from Earth, the harder the vacuum becomes, because there's less density to create any form of pressure.
Yeah.
So the vacuum chamber that Robert and Scott were using would have been equivalent to the Kármán line, i.e. the edge of space.
Yeah.
So as soon as you start getting close to that level, which is not very far away, 60 miles up, it's not very far away, photographic film is affected adversely by the lack of pressure, i.e. by the vacuum. I mentioned outgassing as being one of the major effects of a vacuum. The other one is called cold welding. Now, cold welding, as the name implies, two metals come together. On Earth, if you apply heat and melt those metals, they will combine and they will stick together, and that's what welding is. It's a very well-known science, a very well-known technology, and you see people going with their big goggles because when you start using electric arcs, the light is so intense it can damage the eyes. But it melts the metal. If you get into space, around 10 to the minus 6, you start getting the effects of cold welding. And just in the same way that liquids can have their lighter elements removed or ripped out by the vacuum, the same thing happens with metals. Metals contain all sorts of elements. Even though, say, it's aluminium, that will contain hydrogen. Hydrogen starts to be ripped out of the metal by the vacuum because nothing holding it in. And that hydrogen, helium, other lighter elements go looking for something to adhere to. And if they find another piece of metal similar, they will intermingle the molecules and they will basically weld together. It's a well-known effect of vacuum on metal. So the question is, if you've got metals in your camera or on your spacecraft or on your lander, would those be cold welded at a certain point? Or your spacesuit? If you put the helmet on your spacesuit, it's got a metal connector. So would that metal connector weld together? So you couldn't get the helmet off. Whoops, problem.
I was just going to ask you that. I mean, your work with Robert and Scott has revealed, as far as I'm concerned, it's conclusive in terms of the film. How much testing was done on the actual components, metal components of spacecraft, in terms of the harder vacuum as you go deeper into space? Because this could definitely affect components of a spacecraft, right?
Of course it could, yeah. So far as I know, and I think Scott has done more work on this to find out what research was done at the time of Apollo onto the effect of vacuum on components, he hasn't been able to find very much. It's as if NASA didn't do any testing, or if they did, it's not easy to access. Now, they've obviously done some since then because there is evidence, and NASA have tested a lot of material in various levels, but they can't produce the level of vacuum here on Earth that they would encounter on the lunar surface. That's the major problem. On the lunar surface, the vacuum level is 2 or 10 to the minus 12. That's naught with 12 noughts after it. So far as I know, there is no facility that NASA have access to that can produce that level of vacuum big enough to put components in. So if they can't test them, how do they know what's going to happen? Because one of the other obvious things is, I think it was on Apollo 17 where the lunar rover was used.
Yeah.
And for various reasons, the fender, or as we call it in the UK, the mudguard over the wheel, was damaged and had to be put back because it was kicking up the dust and didn't want the astronauts to be covered in dust. So they had to find something to cover this damaged fender. And they used a map and duct tape. And there are pictures of it. Now, NASA have already said that duct tape or gaffer tape does not work in a vacuum. So how did they manage to do it? And we see it holding this map or whatever it was they used in place. But if gaffer tape can't work in space, that picture couldn't have been taken in space because it wouldn't have held anything in place. Again, a fake picture.
So NASA is in essence contradicting itself.
Yeah, it is. Part of NASA have come up with this idea of faking the Apollo missions because they couldn't actually achieve it. They didn't have the necessary equipment to do it safely, because the one thing they wanted to avoid was killing an astronaut live on television. Remember that? That was one of the great features. We could all watch it happening live on television.
Marcus, I want to ask you this, because this just came to mind and it seems more pertinent now than ever. You're talking about outgassing of materials, and that would apply, I'm assuming, to any material. You would presumably have outgassing of materials in space, in the vacuum of space. We know that the lunar module was a very fragile craft, so much so that it couldn't withstand its own weight here on Earth.
That's right. Yeah.
And there are areas, especially around the astronaut compartment of the lunar module, that had walls equivalent to the thickness of 3 layers of kitchen foil.
Yes.
Anybody can look that up. That's a fact. My question would be, besides an astronaut accidentally putting his foot through the wall, and then instant annihilation for both of the astronauts and the lunar module if that were to happen, my question to you is, how would outgassing in terms of effect over time affect walls equivalent to 3 layers of kitchen foil? I mean, the outgassing would have a faster effect on those walls that were used to contain the astronauts in an environment to keep them alive. I don't think anybody can answer that question on the surface of the moon. They were on the moon for hours. Because
they weren't tested under those conditions, and this is the problem. Now, it's an interesting follow-up on that to an extent. 2 or 3 years ago, the Israeli Space Agency launched their Bereshit, which means Genesis, Bereshit spacecraft, unmanned, to the moon. It was a big achievement. It was financed privately in Israel, and they were very proud of having got the thing off the ground, and it was within a few miles of the lunar surface, and they were just bringing the craft down to land on the lunar surface. Well, they lost all contact with it because basically the craft had crashed.
Yeah.
Now, I happen to know at the time that some of the engine mountings, the rocket engine mounting on the descending craft, had been 3D printed, which is a logical thing to do. But if they hadn't tested the 3D printed material in the conditions that they were going to meet on the lunar surface, those materials may well have failed. I was interviewed on Israeli television about this at the time the Bereshit mission was on its way, and they just heard that it had crashed. And I just mentioned, almost offhand, to the producer, I said, have they tested the 3D printed engine mounting material at a level of vacuum that they were going to meet on the lunar surface? He said, I don't know, but I'll pass it on. I presume it was passed on. I haven't heard anything since, but Israel haven't tried to do any subsequent landings. Now, if that was a lesson, that any material being used on the moon has to be tested at the level of vacuum that we know exists on the moon, if it hasn't been tested, either the stories that are being put out as to the result of those tests are fake, or they have material which can survive. Now, we know that spacecraft have reached the moon. I mentioned the Ranger craft, the Surveyor craft, the orbiter, lunar orbiter craft. Those were all unmanned. They were sent to take photographs, which they did quite successfully. And just before anybody says, well, how were they taking photographs back then? If you say that photographic film doesn't work in a vacuum. No, it doesn't work in a vacuum. They were taking photographs. The point is, the one mission that used photographic film was the Lunar Orbiter, not to be confused with the Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter. That came in 2009.
Yes.
Lunar Orbiter was 1966. Its purpose was to photograph the lunar surface to identify potential landing sites for Apollo. This is when they were still intending to land. And it used photographic film in the spacecraft. And it was developed on board the spacecraft using a Polaroid type system where film can be developed. Edwin Land, who's the developer of the Polaroid cameras and Polaroid system, was one of the advisors to the Lunar Orbiter. But the point of that is that all the camera equipment on the Lunar Orbiter was contained within a pressurized container on the spacecraft.
This was back in the 1960s.
Back in the 1960s.
Yeah.
Which is more or less equivalent time or same sort of time as the Hexagon spy satellite was being developed. So if the Lunar Orbiter was developing its film and it was using photographic film, this stuff, on board the spacecraft, the resulting picture was then scanned on board the spacecraft, transmitted back to Earth, reassembled, and they could then look at the picture. But the point is, it was within a pressurized environment.
So the film, the camera, had its own environment within the spacecraft?
Yes, it did. If you look at the schematics of the Lunar Orbiter and of the Hexagon, you'll see it says pressurized container. So they knew about it. It was pressurized at about 1 pound per square inch.
Yes.
Not very much. They were using nitrogen gas bottles, and the pressure was maintained within the spacecraft. And it could also maintain a degree of temperature, because temperature in space is quite a severe problem, as we may come on to discuss. But pressure and humidity can be kept within acceptable limits for photographic film, which it was on the Lunar Orbiter.
So that was enough to maintain quality photos?
Yes, it could maintain it. 1 pound per square inch. Quite a low level, but enough to maintain the integrity of the photographic film.
If they were to use that same pressurization system for their cameras on the moon, the lunar surface, they would obviously have a bulkier camera to carry.
Yeah.
Correct?
Yeah, quite right. Yeah.
And be a lot more involved in pressurizing and maintaining that pressurization of the film while they were supposedly walking on a lunar surface.
Correct. It would be very obvious if the Hasselblad camera had been pressurized. It would be very obvious because it would be surrounded by, not a very big case, but it would be surrounded by something you could identify. None of the Hasselblad cameras used allegedly on the lunar surface were pressurized, nor were the Maurer film cameras mounted inside the lunar lander. And on Apollo 11, there's photographed the two astronauts prancing around, putting the flag up, talking to the president. And that wasn't pressurized either, because there are pictures of it. Now, if you're going to pressurize anything, it's got to be contained within an airtight container. And it wasn't. I've handled a replica lunar camera. Hasselblad UK have one they'll lend you if you ask them very nicely. And it's accompanied by its own security guard, so you can't run off with it. It's exactly the same in appearance. The replica that I've handled here on Earth on a TV program is exactly the same as you see in the photographs taken allegedly on the lunar surface.
Which proves the point that it was not pressurized.
Wasn't pressurized, no.
Now, I want to ask you this because this has been on my mind ever since you brought it up several minutes ago, and I wrote it down. You mentioned when you were interviewed by Israeli television, you brought up a very good point about the materials outgassing, whether it be an unmanned mission or a manned mission, and that you made the very interesting comment that, well, if they were using materials that did not outgas or they found a way around that, that could not be released, because if that information was released, right there, that just kills the Apollo narrative. I mean,
Yeah.
that's it. It's gone. It's over. And it's gone anyway, as far as I'm concerned. But that would be akin to the work that you, Scott, and Robert have done with the film not working in the vacuum of space. And that's a very interesting point. If their spacecraft failed on the way to the lunar surface, and it was because of the components, the 3D components that they were using, were outgassing, and that could have caused the failure, if they have rectified that, then that also brings into question not only, and this is going to be a very loaded statement, but I want your opinion on this, would that not bring into question not only the manned missions, but some of the unmanned missions?
Oh, certainly it would. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, look at the unmanned missions that have gone to Mars. 50% of those missions failed. Some of them crashed. Some of them, they got the measurements wrong, and they were transmitting in meters, and the craft was accepting it in imperial, so it didn't know what the hell it was talking about. Some of them crashed, and it could well be the same problem, that some of the components, not all of them necessarily, but some of the components would outgas, and if they were structural components and the structure failed, the craft would fail. That's what appears to have happened on the Bereshit Israeli craft. It was the engine mountings which held the engine. Now, if one of those failed, the engine would then not be obeying its commands. It wouldn't be doing what it was supposed to do, and the thing would crash, which is what happened. Now, obviously, the Chinese are fully aware of it because they've landed craft on the moon, and they've also orbited craft around the moon, so they're fully aware. The Soviets have done the same. The Japanese space agency, JAXA, have photographed the lunar surface, and it's been used to show, well, exactly the same as the Apollo photographs. So some of the Apollo photographs must be exactly what we're told the lunar surface looks like. Well, yes, but don't forget that Apollo had the lunar orbiter photographs, so they could create a lunar surface correctly from the photographs, which they did. And Scott and Robert have done a very interesting film recently showing the incredible divergence between the reported dimensions of the Hadley Rill, that's Apollo 15, the Hadley Rill, which is this sort of trench thing that's near the landing spot, we're told. And it's been measured. It was 900 meters deep and 1.5 kilometers across. They compared that to Meteor Crater in Arizona, which is 400 meters deep and about 1 kilometer in diameter, or thereabouts, i.e. smaller than the Hadley Rill. You put the two photographs together, the Hadley Rill and the Meteor Crater in Arizona, you put the two photographs, they look completely different. And yet the Hadley Rill is supposed to be bigger than the Meteor Crater. So they got that wrong.
Yeah. And it's interesting, too, when you brought up the previous manned missions from China, India, Japan, they conveniently don't show any remnants of the Apollo lunar landings on the lunar surface.
Funny that, isn't it?
Isn't it?
Oh, they weren't flying in the same orbit. They weren't attempting to do it. No. They would have done it if they could.
Or you're not allowed to fly over those sites which NASA was trying to impose. I mean, there's just any excuse in the book. Just like the future supposed manned mission coming up is now being pushed back by years, and no surprise there. Proponents have tried to use that against me, and when I come back and they actually post the link and I'm asking, well, where's the remnants? Where's the evidence of the Apollo landing? Well, it's the same photo. Okay, it's the same photo, but there's nothing in that photo that NASA claims. For example, they'll show, let's say, Apollo 11. They'll show the area where Apollo 11 landed, but they don't show any remnants left from the Apollo 11 landing. This is the argument that proponents would use. Well, they used, I forget the name of the spacecraft the Chinese used, but they use those photos all the time to try to prove their point. So they'll show the photo of the area where Apollo 11 landed, but it doesn't show Apollo 11.
No, it doesn't, because it's not there.
Yeah, and when you point that out, well, you're not seeing it. Well,
where is it?
Where is it?
Yeah.
So it's very interesting that all these countries that claim, and I am going to use the word claim, to have gone to the lunar surface in terms of their unmanned missions, fail to show the one significant thing that people would pay to see, and that is photos of the Apollo lunar landings.
Yeah.
And none of them show it.
One agency has shown them, and that's NASA.
Yeah.
They used the Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter. I mentioned the Lunar Orbiter. These are completely different spacecraft.
Yes.
The Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter in 2009 was using camera equipment, we're told, that was equivalent to some of the camera equipment used on Earth-orbiting satellites. And if you look at some of these Earth-orbiting satellites operated by independent companies, they're using camera equipment which can identify an object of 0.4 meters across, quite small. They can identify the same thing on Earth. And these Earth-orbiting satellites, GOI-1 is the main commercial satellite.
Yep.
GOI-1, photographing from 600 kilometers above the Earth's surface, through all the dust and pollution and diffusion that the atmosphere would create. And you can see your own car parked outside your house.
Yeah.
You can see details on that car.
Yep.
Your car's got a sunroof, which is about 3 foot across. You can see that as a separate item on the car. You may not be able to read the number plate on the car, which is always the claim made. Oh, the satellites are so good they can read a newspaper headline from space. Yeah, if the headline's that big, you probably could. But the photographs taken by the Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter, which orbited 60 miles above the lunar surface, and was then deliberately brought down to 15 miles above the lunar surface to photograph the Apollo landing sites, don't show anything except a few pixels. A black pixel and a white pixel.
And no atmosphere.
No atmosphere. It's through the vacuum of space.
Yep.
And it shows absolutely nothing.
And there should be a lot of clarity, given that there's no atmosphere.
I've heard of Photoshop.
Of course.
People have done the research to demonstrate that Photoshop was used on those photographs. It's more NASA desperately trying to bolster its own story by using the same techniques that they used in the first place. Fakery.
And the other thing is, too, and I did put some of those photo comparisons in my book, and when you were talking about the lunar orbiter in the mid-1960s that was used to map out potential landing sites and do a generalized mapping of the lunar surface, you look at those photos, and we're talking, 55 plus years ago, there's a lot of clarity in those photos. I mean, they're comparable to some of the photos I've seen with satellites today. And not only that, but they got down really a low altitude. I mean, you're almost eye level. You were standing on the lunar surface. The clarity of the photos that they had gotten with the lunar orbiter in the mid-1960s,
yeah.
Pre-Apollo missions, I call them.
Yeah.
You compare those photos to the photos, and I'm only speaking specifically of the photos from the Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter in 2009. I'm not talking about the photos that are taken of the entire mapping of the lunar surface. Those photos are excellent.
Yeah.
And then, of course, they're digitized and enhanced and whatnot, but they're really good. But you compare just the photos that that orbiter in 2009 had taken, supposedly had taken of the lunar landing sites, and those photos don't even come anywhere near close to the clarity and definition of the photos taken 55 years ago.
They don't.
Yeah. And you don't have to be a photographic expert to see this one, which is really what I've gotten into it with a couple of people. I don't really talk to them much anymore about it. But you don't have to be, you're a photographic expert, Randy. No, I'm not. But I have eyes. I have common sense.
That's it.
And that's something that they should start using themselves, because you can see it as clear as day, night and day. You can see the contrast between the photos taken from the lunar orbiter in the mid-1960s compared to the one taken in 2009, specifically of the alleged Apollo lunar landing sites. And those photos don't even come close to the clarity of photos taken 55 years ago.
No, they don't. It's almost as if they're trying to hide the fact they could do it 55 years ago, but they can't do it today. It's like, but technology does not go backwards. Technology never goes backwards. Cameras get better, spacecraft get better. It doesn't go backwards, but that's what what appears to be the same. Because NASA are now caught on the horns of a dilemma, and their dilemma is that they claim to have landed humans on the lunar surface, back in the 1960s, late 1960s, but they can't do it now in 2022. They claim to be trying to, but they've now taken, it was first ordered by President Trump in December 2019, NASA will return to the lunar surface, not to plant flags and leave footprints, but to conduct scientific experiments. There's a legitimate statement for a president to make.
Yeah.
We're now in 2022. They haven't even got the rocket off the ground yet, let alone gone into orbit. Certainly not into lunar orbit. And yet we're expected to believe that this is going to happen. NASA themselves have now said that they're unlikely to be able to achieve it before 2028, which is longer, between 2019 and 2028, than it took Apollo to go from a standing start with no equipment and nothing to landing, allegedly, on the lunar surface.
Counter-argument to that is that NASA had a space agency before NASA itself, and that they used that decades of research from that. So they'll say, well, it wasn't a standing start from 1962 onwards, but in essence it was a standing start because the space agency before NASA was signed into existence by President Dwight Eisenhower was really, their contribution was to the aviation world, very little contribution to the outer space world, if I could put it that way. So basically NASA had really little to work with when they were planning the manned mission. So it was a standing start from 1962 to 1969.
Yeah, it was a standing start to put humans into space.
Yes,
they weren't
let alone,
space until Alan Shepard went up in April 61. That was around the time that Yuri Gagarin orbited the Earth, right round the Earth. America couldn't get into orbit. It was John Glenn a year later that went into orbit, first American into orbit. So to say that there was all this work being done is complete nonsense. It's yet another ridiculous statement by the NASA proponents trying desperately to maintain the fiction that NASA landed men on the moon.